HMAS Barcoo was a river-class frigate commissioned for the Australian Navy during World War II. Built by Cockatoo Docks and Engineering Company between 1942 and 1943, the 1,340-tonne ship was commissioned on the 17th of January 1944. The Barcoo saw active service off New Guinea and Borneo, mostly escort service and troop transport, although the ship was also used to bombard Japanese positions. In August 1944, two downed American pilots were rescued by the Barcoo while en route to Langamak. Following the end of the war, the Barcoo was used to transport troops and Allied prisoners of war. In 1946, the ship was refitted in Melbourne and converted into a survey vessel. As a survey ship, she steamed about 54,000 miles around Australia and New Guinea up until April 1948. That year, the waters off South Australia were being resurveyed by the Navy. The Barcoo was in the southeast during January to March. In March, the approaches to Port Adelaide began being charted, with the Barcoo using Port Adelaide as a berth. On the evening of the 7th of April 1948, a 55-year-old woman carrying her 18-month-old granddaughter in her arms was on the wharf looking at the steamer Willesden when she slipped off the edge of the dock and fell into the water. The pair were rescued by nearby sailors, including some men from the Barcoo. They might have thought that was their excitement for the week. Until the 11th of April 1948. Adelaide does not usually experience the extremes of weather which afflict some cities, but on this date one of those infrequent days occurred. A hurricane hit the city, ending a long drought, but demolishing fences, unroofing houses, flooding basements, and blowing out plate glass windows. Whittinglows Engineers Limited lost the 20,000 square foot roof off their factory on Port Road. Somebody could see the funny side at an auto store in Pulteney Street in Adelaide, which lost its frontage anyway. The coast was particularly badly struck. Glenelg's 89-year-old jetty was torn asunder through the middle, leaving an aquarium built in 1929 and tea rooms at the end of the 380-metre pier isolated from the shore. A local man, Archibald Pudney, was stranded when the jetty was pulverised by the huge waves. He and a local constable had been on the end of the jetty watching the police launch Archie Badenoch leave to retrieve a type of small boat called a pinnace, which had broken down on its way to the Barcoo. The constable made a run for it before the planks of the jetty gave way, but Pudney thought the jetty would withstand the onslaught and elected to remain. Although 5 lifesavers swam a half-mile through heavy seas to rescue him the next day, the 59-year-old man, who didn't know how to swim, refused to leap into the sea and be helped back to shore. As it was, the lifesavers were exhausted by their efforts to return and barely made it themselves. Pudney was finally rescued at 10 a.m. on the 12th of April, after 34 hours on the ruined structure, with the aid of a dinghy. The remains of the jetty were demolished in 1949 and a new, shorter jetty not built until 1969. The remains of smaller boats and fishing ketches were littered along the beach. The 34-foot pinnace from the Barcoo ended up near the car park at the end of Anzac Highway. 3 sailors who had fallen into the sea when the pinnace went were rescued, although one sailor was close to collapse when brought ashore. The police launch had regained its moorings, but after the storm broke at 1:30 a.m, the mooring chain snapped. The 2 constables in charge set out to sea to avoid the 15-foot waves, going out 7 miles and becoming lost as the driving rain prevented them from seeing the lights of shore. They came back trying to sight the jetty, which by the time was mostly gone. Eventually they came back at the mouth of the Patawalunga estuary, and in trying to beach the craft were swept overboard, but struggled ashore to safety. As for the Barcoo, the ship was picked up by the waves and carried onto West Beach. At about 5 a.m, a Mrs. Beasley, who was holidaying with her husband in one of the beach shacks which used to line the coast here, woke and looked outside to see the bow of the ship approaching on what seemed to her to be a collision course. She ran outside waving a lantern, yelling, "You can't come any further. It's all land here." As it was, the Barcoo was run aground about 50 metres away from the shack in 8 feet of water. Between 12:30 and 2 p.m, some members of the crew were transferred ashore, but 50 still remained aboard. Tremendous seas crashed into the ship between 2 and 5, preventing any further disembarkations, and when high water was reached around 6 o'clock, the Barcoo was pushed further up the beach by the force of the waves. The ship quickly became a magnet for sightseers, with thousands of locals making the journey to see for themselves. The wind whipped the sand against the legs of women wearing dresses, stinging the skin with its ferocity. On the afternoon of the 12th of April, two tugs, the Watteau and the Wounda, stood by to attempt to pull the Barcoo back to sea on the high tide, but the water level didn't rise as high as it had during the storm surge. Nevertheless, the ship was moved 50 feet, which provided encouragement. An enterprising milkman drove his cart onto the beach on Tuesday and sold fresh milk to the grateful crew. Arrangements were also made for the local newsagent to deliver newspapers. Later that day, two tugs, the Wounda and the Foremost, were positioned to try again. About 1,000 spectators had gathered by 3 p.m. to watch the effort. The tugs began their work at 6 p.m. with high tide and worked until 9 p.m. Although there was some slight shifting, the result was disappointing, and the Barcoo remained stuck, tilted to starboard on the sand, for another night. On board, water was running low and was rationed, and biscuits and tinned food were being eaten. Most of the ship's oil had been lost when it listed, but the oil-burning galley was still able to provide some hot meals. After the second attempt to refloat the vessel, it was decided to pump out most of the remaining oil to lighten the ship. On the evening of the 14th of April, a further attempt by the two tugs met similar failure. On the 15th of April, the ship's mascot, a fox terrier named Crab, went AWOL while on shore leave. After 2 hours of searching for the dog, he reappeared with signs that he had found one of the rabbits living in the sandhills. On the 16th of April, a pipe was laid across the beach to provide fresh water to the ship, and a cable connecting it to the telephone system installed. No further attempts to move it were made, while sand around the propellers was inspected by divers, and a dredge towed into position if required. Sightseers kept arriving, providing the Glenelg restaurants and cafes with their best out-of-season business in years. A large group of people got trapped on a sandbar by the rising tide while observing the Barcoo, and were forced to wade through the water back ashore. On Sunday the 18th of April, with preparations being made for the fourth attempt to move the ship underway and the weather warm, 80,000 people are estimated to have come to watch the spectacle. Trams from Adelaide to Glenelg and Henley were at their busiest in years, and extra buses needed to be put on the Somerton route. Cars blocked all roads leading to the beach, and police were called in to direct the traffic. Others arrived in yachts and canoes. People took advantage of the pieces of the old jetty to use as seats. Picnics were set up and a festival air prevailed. Some children were reported lost, but all found, with one 7-year-old boy, Franklin Bridgewater, managing to walk home to Goodwood, several miles away. Some people stood for hours watching as ammunition, shell by shell, was removed to lighten the ship, and hundreds of photographs were taken. Police needed to clear the spectators away after they trampled the phone cable into the sand, disrupting communications, and impeding the arrival of bulldozers, used to help clear away the sand. The bulldozers proved ineffective anyway, as cables connecting them to buckets kept breaking as they worked. The dredge, meanwhile, cleared a channel astern of the Barcoo, working all weekend to do so. 350 tons of fuel oil was offloaded onto lighters, and provisions removed. On the 19th, the Barcoo was shifted slightly towards the channel dredged for it, and the ship rocked in the high tide. Almost all the stores had been taken off by now, and it was planned that the ship's guns would be removed, if it needed to be lightened any further. Finally, on the night of the 20th of April, the Barcoo managed to free itself from the sandbank, using its stern anchors to pull itself free, and with towing from another naval vessel. Tackle rigged on either side of the ship provided pulling power of 100 tons. The wind was blowing and the seas were heavy, which assisted the effort, making the water deeper than it otherwise would have been. With a tow line from the stern of the Barcoo to the stern of another survey ship, the Warrego, the ship began to slide off the sandbar at about 4 p.m, watched by 200 people. The Warrego began towing the liberated ship through the channel and into deep water, and from there it was taken up the coast to No. 2 Wharf at Outer Harbour, and then to Port Adelaide. As there was no structural or engineering damage found following an inspection, the Barcoo received the oil back from the lighters, and following a message of appreciation for all who aided the salvage effort from the captain, at 3:50 p.m. on the 2nd of May, set sail for Sydney under her own power. As a precaution, the ship went at half speed only. The captain of the Barcoo was charged with having negligently or by fault hazarded his ship and stranded it in June 1948. At the court-martial, Lieutenant David Haslam gave evidence that solid green waves had broken over the bridge and at times had completely submerged the forward gun. Lieutenant Commander McRae, the engineer of the Barcoo, stated he had been asked by the captain to raise steam when he came aboard at 3 a.m. He reported engines ready at 4:45 a.m, but at 5 a.m. a heavy sea came into the engine room and put out the ship's lighting and reduced pressure in the boiler. The charges against the captain were not proved. The Barcoo's woes continued in July 1948, when the ship was in port at Darwin. A girder jutting out from the wharf entered a porthole, and when the tide fell, the weight of the ship went onto the girder, which ripped a hole a foot wide up from the porthole. During the 1950s and 60s, the ship was used for survey work, steaming over 340,000 nautical miles. The Barcoo was decommissioned and placed in reserve before being sold for scrap on the 15th of February 1972. The ship was towed from Sydney in March of 1972, bound for Taiwan to be broken up. Today, the only reminder of the 9 days' wonder back in 1948 is the road leading to the West Beach Marina, named Barcoo Road. There is just one more thing to add. In that wonderfully strange way that fate plays with us, the captain of the Barcoo, beached by a storm, was Lieutenant Commander Gale.